What happens when the heart of a machine stops beating? What secrets die with its creator? And what monsters are unleashed when the keeper of the cage forgets his one crucial duty? The tick-tick-ticking was the first thing to get under your skin. It wasn't the clean, precise sound of a pocket watch, but a wet, labored rhythm, like a rusty piston struggling in a diseased heart. For Alistair Finch, on his first solo night shift, it was the soundtrack to a slow-burning madness. The sound echoed down the corridor of Blackwater Asylum's special wing, a syncopated counterpoint to the constant hiss of steam in the pipes overhead and the low, harmonic hum that seemed to vibrate through the very iron grates under his boots. His hands were sweating inside his stiff, new leather gloves. The key ring felt alien and heavy on his belt, a collection of jagged teeth that promised access to things no man should see. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, hot brass, and something else, something coppery and organic that he associated with butcher shops. Midnight round is for show, Finch. A presence. Warden Graves had told him, his voice like gravel being crushed. The 3 o'clock round is for survival. Don't be late. Don't be early. And for God's sake, don't miss cell number 1. Cell number 1. The clockwork crone. Finch approached the reinforced door. It was made of cold, black iron, with a single, thick porthole of greenish glass. Through it, he could see the faint, gaslit glow from within. He fumbled with the keys, the clinking of metal on metal unnaturally loud in the rhythmic silence. The lock turned with a heavy, satisfying thunk. The cell was small, circular, and dominated by a complex arrangement of hissing copper pipes that snaked across the ceiling, converging over the room's lone occupant. She sat in a high-backed chair, bolted to the floor. At first glance, she was just an old woman, wrapped in a coarse gray blanket, her head lolling on her chest as if in sleep. Her hair was a wispy white cloud. Then you saw the other half. The right side of her face was a masterwork of polished brass and porcelain, a seamless, terrifying mask. A single, camera-like lens of flawless glass was set where her eye should have been. From the blanket, her right arm emerged, a beautiful, skeletal thing of articulated brass rods and whirring gears, ending in delicate, metal fingers that lay perfectly still in her lap. But the sound, the ticking, was loudest here. It came from her chest, a steady, grinding lube-dub that was the core of the asylum's strange symphony. This was Margaret. Finch's own heart hammered against his ribs. He pulled the special key from his pocket, a long, intricate piece of filigreed steel, unlike any other. It was warm to the touch. "Evening, ma'am," he whispered, his voice cracking. The brass eye rotated with a soft whir, its lens focusing on him with a faint click. The human side of her mouth twitched. "You are the new one." Her voice was a discordant blend of frail, old woman's rasp layered over a gritty, mechanical buzz, like words forced through a damaged gramophone. The scared one. "I'm not scared," Finch lied, moving behind her chair. There, set into the back of her neck, just below the hairline, was a keyhole of breathtaking complexity. "A lie," Margaret buzzed softly. "I can hear it. Your rhythm is all wrong. Jarring. The song is already fraying at the edges, boy. Can't you hear it?" Finch swallowed. He could only hear the ticking, the hissing, the humming. He inserted the key. It fit perfectly. "It's time for your winding." "My winding," she repeated, and he could have sworn the mechanical eye dimmed. Or the world's. He didn't understand. He began to turn the key. It was hard, the resistance immense, as if he were winding up the entire, terrible weight of the asylum itself. With each turn, a series of deeper, more profound clicks echoed from within her, and the ticking from her chest grew stronger, more confident. The copper pipes above seemed to hum, with increased pressure. The faint, harmonic drone from the corridor outside smoothed, becoming a purr. After 24 turns, the key would turn no more. He pulled it out, his arm aching. The ticking was now a powerful, metronomic beat. Margaret's brass fingers twitched, then curled into a loose fist. "The song is stable. For now," she said, her dual voice weary. "But the composer is dead, and the musicians are growing restless. You must listen, boy. When the music stops, that is when the real performance begins. A sudden, violent clanging erupted from down the hall, the sound of a heavy body throwing itself against a cell door. Ironsides is coming. The walls are breathing. A man roared, his voice raw with terror. Finch jumped, his nerves screaming. He backed away from Margaret, his duty done. Her lens followed him to the door. "Don't forget me, Alistair Finch," she buzzed, her voice barely audible over the new cacophony. "My life is in your hands, and so many more lives are in mine." He fled, locking the iron door behind him, sealing her and her cryptic warnings inside. He leaned against the cold metal, trying to catch his breath, trying to unhear her words. He told himself it was just the rambling of a broken thing, part woman, part machine. He was wrong. It was a prophecy, and in his rush to quell the disturbance down the hall and the overwhelming stress of the night, he would fail to heed it. The memory of her warning would be washed away in a tide of adrenaline and fear, leaving only the routine, soon to be forgotten. The ticking was strong. The system was stable. What could possibly go wrong? The clanging from down the hall was a brutal, discordant crash against the asylum's fragile symphony. Finch's heart, still racing from Margaret's ominous words, now hammered a frantic, panicked rhythm. He fumbled for his heavy baton, its weight a cold comfort, and ran towards the noise, the rhythmic tick-tick-ticking from cell 1 fading behind him. The corridor was a gallery of horrors, each cell a unique instrument in Blackwater's orchestra. As he passed cell 3, the low, harmonic hum he'd felt through the grates intensified, resolving into a beautiful, sorrowful chord. Through the barred window, he saw them, the whispering choir. Lara, Cora, and Phineas sat in a perfect triangle, their mouths slightly agape. No words came out, only that pure, resonant sound. Their throats showed subtle, metallic glints where vocal cords should have been. Their eyes were vacant, fixed on some internal horizon, their entire beings dedicated to producing that stabilizing frequency. The beauty of it was a lie. It felt like oral bleach, sanitizing the air of true emotion. The source of the clamor was cell 7. The iron door shuddered in its frame with every impact. "The angles are closing. The pressure is increasing," bellowed the voice from within. Finch peered through the observation slit. Ironsides, Bartholomew, was a mountain of a man, his skin pale and stretched tight over a frame that seemed too dense, too rigid. With a sickening crunch, he drove his shoulder into the door again. Finch saw the man's back through his thin shirt. Beneath the fabric, a grid of raised, iron-hard ridges crossed his skin like an internal cage. His paranoia wasn't just in his mind. It was a physical reality, his reinforced skeleton translating delusion into terrifying force. "Stand back, Bartholomew," Finch shouted, his voice trembling. It was a useless command. A new sound joined the chaos, a high, keening wail from cell 5. Finch glanced in to see Silas, known as Stitches, convulsing on his cot. A web of fine, copper wire was sutured directly into his skin, tracing the paths of his nerves. Now those wires glowed with a faint, sizzling orange light. He was twitching, his back arched, his fingers clawing at the air. Too many signals, the fire in the walls, stopped the current. He gasped. He was a living antenna, and the system's instability was electrocuting him from the inside out. "Finch, what is the meaning of this disruption?" The voice was like a wire brush scraping over rusted iron. Matron Agatha Crabbe stood at the end of the corridor, a solid, imposing silhouette against the flickering gaslight. She moved with a grim, purposeful stride, her heavy boots echoing. In her hand, she carried out a medical kit, but a thick, leather-bound strap. As she got closer, Finch saw the tools tucked into it. A small, polished hammer, a set of tension-adjusting wrenches, a long, needle-like probe. She didn't even look at Finch. She went straight to cell 7, pulled a master key from her belt, and unlocked the door. Before Ironsides could charge again, she stepped inside and brought the leather strap down hard on the man's arm with a crack that made Finch flinch. It wasn't just a blow. It was a precise strike against a specific pressure point on his metallic frame. Ironsides roared, but it was a roar of surprise and short-circuited pain. He staggered back, clutching his arm where a faint click had been audible. "Your alignment is slipping, Unit 7, Matron Crab stated, her voice devoid of anger or compassion. It was pure, cold diagnostics. "Another outburst, and I will recalibrate your joint hydraulics. You will find it most uncomfortable." She turned her gaze to cell 5. Stitches had curled into a fetal position, sobbing. "And you, Unit 5, your sensitivity is a design flaw, not a privilege. Regulate your intake, or I will install a dampener." She then looked at the whispering choir, who had fallen silent during the commotion. "Resume. The harmony must be maintained." As if a switch had been flipped, the beautiful, sorrowful chord resumed, smoothing the ragged edges of the air. Matron Crab finally turned to Finch. Her eyes were small, dark, and missed nothing. "Compassion is a flaw and a guard, Finch. Empathy is a mechanical failure. These are not people. They are intricate, malfunctioning machines. Your job is not to comfort them. It is to ensure they function within their specified parameters. Do you understand?" Finch could only nod, his throat tight. He thought of his mother, her spirit broken not by illness, but by the institutional cruelty of a place not unlike this. He had come here to be different, but Blackwater was a beast that consumed difference. As Matron Crab marched away, a soft voice spoke from the last cell in the corridor, cell 12. "She's wrong, you know." Finch turned. The cell was different. No visible machinery, no ticking, no humming. Just a young woman with intelligent, fearful eyes, sitting on a simple cot. Her file said her name was Alara, admitted for female hysteria. She was the only patient who looked back at him like a person. "About what?" Finch asked, his voice barely a whisper. "About them being machines," Alara said, hugging her knees. "The machines are just cages. The people are still trapped inside. And a cage that feels pain is a far crueler thing than simple walls." She looked down the hall towards Margaret's cell, her expression unreadable. "She's the key, isn't she? The old one. She doesn't just keep time for herself. She keeps it for all of them." Finch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. Alara saw it too. She saw the connections he was only beginning to sense. He gave her a curt, nervous nod and continued his rounds, the weight of his duties now compounded by a dawning, horrific understanding. This wasn't an asylum, it was a single, complex, living engine, and Margaret Greaves was its beating heart. The following day offered no respite. The asylum, bathed in the weak, grimy light filtering through high, barred windows, felt even more menacing. The night's chaos had left a residue in the air, a tension that thrummed alongside the ever-present steam and ticking. Finch's mind was a whirlpool, churning with Margaret's warnings, Alara's insight, and Matron Crab's brutal philosophy. He needed answers. He needed context for the horror. His search led him to the asylum's underbelly, the archive, cavernous, dust-choked room deep in the administrative wing. It was a mausoleum for forgotten souls and abandoned ideas. The air was thick with the smell of decaying paper and old leather. Towering shelves were crammed with patient ledgers, treatment logs, and schematics yellowed with age. Driven by a desperate need to understand, he began to pull down the oldest volumes, those dating back to the asylum's founding by the illustrious Dr. Septimus Blackwood. The early entries were filled with grand, sweeping prose. Blackwood wrote not of illness, but of calibration. Not of therapy, but of optimization. "The human mind is but a complex engine," Finch read, his fingers leaving smudges on the elegant script. "Emotions are merely steam pressure, necessary for motion, but catastrophic if unregulated. Delusion is a slip gear. Melancholy, leaky valve. My life's work is to become the master engineer of the soul." Finch's blood ran cold. He found the ledger for Project Chimera. The first entry was a name, Margaret Greaves. Admitted 1841. Diagnosis, acute melancholic hysteria, with profound somatic fixation. Prognosis, terminal decline. Proposed treatment, full symbiotic integration. The pages that followed were a descent into madness, meticulously documented. Schematics showed the brass and porcelain chassis that would become her right side. Notes detailed the kinetic heart, a mainspring of revolutionary design intended to bring perfect, metronomic order to a chaotic emotional core. But as the project progressed, Blackwood's notes evolved. Margaret was no longer just a patient. She was his magnum opus, his prime symbiote. Remarkable, one entry exclaimed. Subject grieves does not merely tolerate the integration, she synergizes. Her cognitive processes, when channeled through the analytical logic engine, demonstrate a latent capacity for systemic regulation. She is not just a cured patient. She is a catalyst for cure. I have designed a secondary, subsonic harmonic network, linking the other subject's modifications to her core rhythm. She is the conductor. They are her orchestra. Blackwater shall be a single, perfect, self-regulating machine. Finch stumbled back, the ledger falling from his hands with a thud that echoed in the silent room. It was true. Every word. Margaret was the central processor. The patients weren't just individuals. They were nodes in a network, their own broken minds stabilized by their connection to her. Blackwood hadn't just built Asylum. He had built an ecosystem, with Margaret as its keystone. He needed to hear it from someone who was there. Gathering his courage, he went to the one person who might have the final piece of the puzzle, Professor Alistair Abernathy in Cell 10. Abernathy's cell was a tragic paradox. It was filled with beautiful, hand-drawn schematics of steam pneumatic systems and elegant clockwork mechanisms pinned to the walls. But the man himself was trapped in a monstrous contraption. A heavy, articulated brass brace encased his torso and left arm, its gears locked, holding him in a perpetual, half-reclined position. It was a therapeutic immobilizer, designed to still his agitated genius. Finch entered cautiously. Professor Abernathy? The old man's eyes, bright with intelligence and frustration, focused on Finch. You are the new one. You have the look of a man who has just read my old partner's diaries. His voice was thin, strained by his constricted chest. You designed the systems, Finch said, gesturing to the pipes on the ceiling. You knew what Blackwood was doing. I designed the ventilation, the pressure controls, the hydraulic doors. Abernathy insisted, a flicker of pride in his eyes. I built a nervous system for this place. A beautiful, efficient nervous system. Septimus, he provided the brain, and the soul. He looked away, towards the general direction of Margaret's cell. He asked me to modify the designs, to link them all to her. I warned him. I told him it was a perversion, to make a living woman a part of the architecture. It was a Faustian bargain. What happens if she fails? Finch asked, his voice barely a whisper. Abernathy's face fell. The nervous system I built is still there. But without the brain, it goes haywire. The signals have no regulator. The steam has no governor. The harmony has no conductor. He struggled against his brace, a futile gesture. The orchestra, boy, without its conductor, it doesn't just stop playing. It tears itself apart. The music becomes noise, and noise is violence. The pieces clicked into place with the finality of a cell door slamming shut. Margaret wasn't just a patient to be wound. She was the linchpin holding back an avalanche of chaos. Blackwood's ghost didn't just haunt the archives. It was woven into the very fabric of the asylum, a malevolent intelligence that had outsourced its will to a half-human, half-machine woman. Finch left Abernathy's cell, the professor's warning ringing in his ears louder than any alarm bell. He had thought his duty was a simple, morbid task. Now he knew it was a sacred trust. The weight of it was crushing. The symphony of steel and suffering was more fragile than he could have ever imagined, and he was the one tasked with keeping the conductor alive. The knowledge was a poison in Finch's veins. Every tick from Margaret's cell, every harmonious drone from the choir, every hiss of steam now felt like the countdown to an abyss he now knew existed. For the next 2 days, he performed his duties with a robotic precision, his mind screaming while his body went through the motions. The 3 o'clock winding became a terrifying sacrament. He would insert the key, feel the immense resistance of the mainspring, and listen as the world, her world, clicked back into a fragile, Temporary order. The song is fraying. Alistair Finch. She had buzzed the night before, her lens fixed on him. Can you not feel the static in the wires? He could. It was in the way stitches now whimpered constantly. The way the whispering choir's chord would occasionally flicker into a minor key for a single, chilling second before correcting itself. The machine was stressed. He was its stressed custodian. On the third night, the storm broke. It began at 2:30. A guttural scream tore through the relative quiet, followed by the sound of shattering glass. It came from a common washroom. Finch, who had been staring at the clock face in the guard station, watching the minute hand crawl towards its fateful appointment, jolted to his feet. He sprinted down the corridor, his boots slipping on the polished stone. He found Ironsides. The giant of a man had torn a porcelain sink from the wall and was now swinging it like a mace, shattering the mirrors. The angles. They're acute. They cut, he bellowed, his eyes wide with a terror that was both mental and physical. Water geysered from broken pipes, spraying the room in a cold mist. Finch's training evaporated. All he could see was the potential for catastrophic damage, for injury. He shouted. He pleaded. He tried to maneuver around the flailing man. This was not a malfunctioning machine. This was a terrified human being trapped in a living nightmare, and Finch's own humanity responded in kind. He forgot the clock. He forgot the key in his pocket. He forgot everything but the crisis before him. It took himself and the two brutish orderlies, Jasper and Rufus, 10 minutes of struggling, of taking blows from the heavy, iron-reinforced man, to finally subdue Ironsides with the leather strap to the knees, a precise strike to a mechanical joint that made his legs buckle. As they dragged the sobbing, raving man back to his cell, Finch was panting, soaked and bruised. His uniform was torn. His mind was a scrambled mess of adrenaline and pity. He looked up at the clock on the wall. It was 3:43. His blood turned to ice. Margaret. He abandoned the orderlies, not hearing their curses, and ran. His heart was no longer hammering. It was a frantic bird trying to escape the cage of his ribs. The corridor seemed to stretch, an impossible distance. The ticking from cell 1, which had been the background hum of his existence, was gone. He hadn't noticed its absence in the chaos, but now the silence was a physical void, a suffocating blanket. 3:46. He skidded to a halt outside her door, fumbling for his keys. His hands were shaking, slippery with water and sweat. He dropped the ring. The clatter on the stone floor was obscenely loud. He snatched it up, his vision blurring, and found the key. He jammed it into the lock, turned it, and threw the door open. 3:47. The scene inside was horribly still. Margaret sat in her chair, exactly as always, but the absence of sound was deafening. The powerful, metronomic tick-tick-tick that had filled the space was gone. The copper pipes overhead were silent. There was no whir of her eye, no grind of her internal gears. The only sound was the drip of water from his own clothes onto the stone floor. "No, no, no," he whispered, rushing to her side. Her human eye was half open, unseeing. The brass lens was dull, a dead piece of glass. He put a hand on her shoulder, the human one. It was cold. He touched the brass of her arm. It was room temperature. The life, the terrible, magnificent energy that had animated her was gone. "Margaret," he pleaded, shaking her gently. "I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm here now." There was no response. No final buzzing prophecy. No whir of a focusing lens. Just silence. A new sound began to filter into the cell, faint at first, then growing. It wasn't a scream of rage or pain, but a low, collective moan of distress from down the corridor. It was the sound of system detecting a fatal error. Finch stumbled back, his hand over his mouth. He had done it. He had committed the unforgivable. He had forgotten the conductor. And in the profound, absolute silence of cell number 1, he finally heard the truth. He had been too busy, too scared, too human to understand. The performance was over, and in the silence, the real horror was just waiting to take the stage. The silence in Margaret's cell was not an absence. It was a presence. It was a heavy, living entity that pressed in on Finch's eardrums, a void so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. He stood frozen, his own ragged breaths a sacrilege in the stillness. The drip, drip, drip from his soaked uniform was a funeral drum. Then the world broke. It started with a single, sharp crack from the whispering choir's cell, like a crystal glass shattering. The beautiful, sorrowful chord that had been the asylum's bedrock for years fractured. It didn't just stop, it unraveled. The single note splintered into three separate, dissonant tones. A shrieking soprano from Alara, patient, a guttural baritone from Phineas, and a wavering, atonal keen from Cora. The sound was no longer harmonic, it was a physical weapon, a wave of sonic distortion that made the gaslights in their sconces flicker violently and sent a splintering pain directly into Finch's teeth. He clapped his hands over his ears, staggering out of Margaret's cell and back into the corridor. The air itself felt different, thicker, charged with a malevolent energy. The hiss of the steam pipes was no longer rhythmic. It was a frantic, gasping sound, like a beast dying of asphyxiation. From cell 5, Stitch's whimpering escalated into a full-throated, endless scream. It's all of them. Every mind at once. Make it stop. The fine copper wires sutured into his skin were no longer glowing with a faint orange, but blazing with the searing white-hot light. He was convulsing on the floor, his body arcing like a thing possessed, smoking where the wires met his flesh. He was no longer just receiving static. He was being consumed by the raw, unfiltered psychic feedback of 100 broken minds suddenly cut loose from their regulator. Finch ran, not knowing where he was going, driven only by a primal need to find someone in authority, to fix what he had broken. He passed cell 8. Inside, the patient known as Lamplight was no longer catatonic. She was standing in the center of a room, her head thrown back, her lens-like eyes projecting a frantic, strobing nightmare onto the ceiling. It was a chaotic collage of spinning gears, screaming faces, and the endless, ticking interior of Margaret's own mind, now playing on a loop without a destination. The projections bled through the stone, casting frantic, shifting shadows down the hall. He burst into the main guard station, his face a mask of panic. Warden Graves. The system Margaret Shees. Warden Graves was already on his feet, but he was not the composed, severe man Finch knew. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with a terror that was far beyond anger. He wasn't looking at Finch. He was staring at a large, central pressure gauge on the wall, its needle whipping back and forth erratically from the green into the shuddering red zone. "You!" Graves whispered, his voice hollow with dread. He finally turned his gaze to Finch, and it was the look a man gives his executioner. "You failed to wind to prime. There was an incident with Ironsides. Silence," Graves roared, slamming his fist on the table. The violence of the gesture was undercut by the sheer panic in his eyes. "You have no idea what you have done. You have not killed a patient, you fool. You have pulled the plug on the universe." He pointed a trembling finger at the gauge. She was the governor, the regulator. Without her rhythm, the steam pressure has no baseline. The harmonic synchronization is gone. The patients, their modifications, they are overloading. They are feedback loops with no off switch. As if to punctuate his words, a deafening klaxon began to blare, the primary pressure alarm. A jet of superheated steam erupted from a pipe joint further down the hall, scalding the air with the piercing shriek. The pneumatic door to a supply closet began slamming open and shut, with mindless, frantic speed. She wasn't a patient, Finch said, the full, horrific truth finally crashing down on him. She was the central unit, Blackwood's central unit. Graves let out a bitter, choked sound that was almost a laugh. Of course she was. She was the only thing holding this entire damned experiment together. And you with your soft heart and your clumsy hands, you've just sentenced us all to hell. The warden turned and ran toward his office, likely to try and initiate some catastrophic emergency protocol. Finch was left alone in the chaos, the screaming, the shrieking pipes, and the blinding, nightmare light shows. The symphony was over. This was the sound of the orchestra setting itself on fire. And he was the one who had thrown the match. The blaring klaxon was a death rattle. It was not a call to action, a final, screaming confirmation of systemic death. The world Finch had known, a world of oppressive, ticking order, had dissolved into a maelstrom of uncontrolled energy. He stood paralyzed in the guard station, the wardens retreating back, offering no solace, only a final, damning indictment. The failure was no longer a single, silent cell. It was a contagion, spreading through the asylum's metallic veins. The initial sonic assault from the whispering choir had subsided, not into harmony, but into three distinct, warring frequencies. Ilara's shriek was a needle driven into the temple. Phineas's guttural drone vibrated in the chest cavity, and Cora's wavering keen felt like ants crawling under the skin. The sound was no longer a unified field. It was a schism, tearing the very air apart. From within Stitch's cell, the screaming had stopped. A new sound had taken its place. A low, wet, sizzling, like meat on a griddle. Thin tendrils of acrid smoke curled out from under his door, carrying the smell of burning pork and melting insulation. The feedback had cooked him from the inside out, overloading the very nerves his copper wire enhancements were meant to regulate. He was now a burnt-out fuse in a circuit with no breaker. Then the lights failed. Not all at once, but in a cascading wave. The gas lights flickered, dimmed, and then were snuffed out as the primary gas regulator, deprived of its timed commands from Margaret's core, slammed shut. For a heart-stopping moment, absolute darkness reigned, punctuated only by the hellish chorus and the shriek of escaping steam. Then the emergency systems kicked in, a dim, orange glow from bioluminescent fungal cultures housed in glass spheres along the baseboards, a last resort system designed by Abernathy. The corridors were now bathed in a sickly, pulsating twilight, casting long, dancing shadows that made the chaos feel subterranean, demonic. The doors began their dance of the damned. All down the special wing, the pneumatic locks, their timing mechanisms unmoored, engaged in a frantic, random ballet. Thunk-click, thunk-click. Cell doors slammed open and shut with violent, unpredictable speed. Finch watched in horror as the door to cell 9 shot open, revealing a patient who simply stared into the Hell's Cape before it slammed shut a second later. The door to cell 4 shuttered open and then remained ajar, a gaping dark maw. It was from this cell that a figure emerged. Reverend Elias Thorne, his face ecstatic in the fungal glow, raised his powerful, fully mechanical arm. The polished steel fingers whirred as they clenched into a fist. "Hark!" he cried out, his voice ringing with fervent joy over the din. "The hour of the great ungearing is upon us. The mainspring of this false world has snapped. We are being unmade, so that we may be remade in the image of the true Mechanicus." He brought his metal fist down on a steam pipe running along the wall. The metal buckled, and a jet of hot vapor erupted with a deafening hiss, filling the corridor with the thick, blinding fog. In the eerie orange light, the Reverend was a prophet silhouetted against damnation. This was not a simple riot. It was a deconstruction. Every automated system, every synchronized process, every calibrated pressure was reverting to its base, chaotic state. The asylum was not being destroyed from the outside. It was disintegrating from within, its own intricate components turning against one another. The perfect, self-regulating machine that Blackwood had built was now a catastrophic engine of its own destruction. Finch understood now. His failure hadn't just released the patients. It had uncreated the world they were trapped in. And from the smoldering ruins of that world, something new, something entirely feral and unrestrained, was being born. The great unraveling was only just beginning. The chaos was no longer an external force. It had become a new, terrible reality. The random slamming of doors, the hissing steam, the dissonant choir. It was the environment now. And within this hellish new world, the inhabitants of Blackwater were no longer patients. They were raw, unfiltered ID, their deepest pathologies amplified and made manifest by their failing mechanical cages. Finch, crouched behind the relative safety of the guard station's heavy oak desk, was a prisoner of his own horror. He could not go forward into the maelstrom, and he could not go back. He could only witness. From the partially opened door of Cell 7, a new sound joined the symphony, the groan of tortured metal. Ironsides was no longer screaming about the walls. He was methodically, terrifyingly, proving his point. Using his own reinforced frame as a battering ram, he was attacking the stone corner of his cell. Crunch! A shower of dust and debris. Crunch! A web of cracks appeared in the thick wall. His paranoia had been a premonition. The world was closing in, and his only response was to use the cage of his body to break the cage of stone. He was a living demolition ball, driven by a singular, devastating logic. Across the hall, in Cell 8, Lamplight's silent nightmares had become a public broadcast. Her lens-like eyes, overloading with synaptic feedback, projected her terror not just on her ceiling, but through the small barred window of her door. The corridor wall became her canvas. One moment it showed a vast, spinning gear, its teeth snapping off and flying into a void. The next, it was a close-up of Margaret's dead, human eye, staring sightlessly, a single tear of black oil tracing a path through the wrinkles. Then it was Finch's own face, twisted in panic, reflected back at him from the night before. She was projecting the collective unconscious of the asylum, a visual scream that was all the more horrifying for its silence. But the most profound change was in the whispering choir. They had not left their cell, but their unity had shattered. Ilara, Cora, and Phineas were no longer a perfect triangle. They were backed into separate corners, their mouths still agape, but now each was emitting a sound that was purely, uniquely their own private torment. Ilara's was a continuous, high-frequency whine of pure anxiety. Phineas produced a low, stuttering rhythm like a failing engine. Cora's was a wet, gurgling sob, as if she were drowning in the dissonance. The beautiful, unifying chord was gone, replaced by the stark, lonely sounds of three separate breakdowns. Their cage was not the cell, but the failure of their connection. And then there was Beatrice. Her cell was next to the guard station. Through the bars, Finch could see her. She sat on her cot, rocking gently. The delicate music box in her chest, which had always played a soft, haunting lullaby, was now spinning out of control. The tune was recognizable for a bar. Then it would speed into a frantic, jangling cacophony, then slow to a distorted, dragging dirge. The mechanism was trying to find a rhythm in a world that had none, and the strain was audible. A fine hairline crack had appeared on the porcelain shell over her heart. She was humming along, trying to follow the maddening tune, her eyes wide with its confused sadness. Her cage was the memory of a song she could no longer remember correctly. This wasn't the rage of freed monsters. It was the agony of broken things. Their mechanical parts, designed to control them, had become the instruments of their torture. The Reverend saw rapture. Ironside saw crushing walls. Lamplight saw endless nightmares, and the choir heard only the screaming of their own isolation. They were not attacking the world. They were trapped in the collapsing fortresses of their own minds, and the world was simply caught in the crossfire. Finch buried his face in his hands. Matron Crab was wrong. They weren't machines. And Warden Graves was wrong. This wasn't hell. It was a hospital where every patient was simultaneously undergoing a catastrophic, internal surgery without anesthesia. And he, Alistair Finch, had been the one to hand them the scalpel. The heavy oak door to the main guard station burst inwards, splintering around the lock. Finch scrambled back, his heart in his throat, expecting Ironsides or the raving Reverend. But it was Warden Graves, flanked by Jasper and Rufus. They were transformed. Gone was the veneer of clinical authority. In its place was the grim desperation of soldiers in a losing war. They had traded their standard-issue batons for a long, brutal-looking steam-powered rivet gun and a heavy pry bar tipped with a sharpened wedge. Graves' eyes, wild and bloodshot, scanned the chaotic corridor before locking onto Finch. There was no accusation left in them, only a frantic, operational fury. "You, get up. This is your mess. You will help contain it. We have to help them." Finch shouted over the din, gesturing towards the cells where private agonies were playing out. "We can't just help them." Graves roared, striding forward and grabbing Finch by his soaked, torn tunic. There is no them to help. They are corrupted files, glitched machinery. The only help left is a hard reset. The Blackwood Protocol. He shoved Finch towards the orderlies. Jasper, the suppressor. Cell 7 first. He's the most structurally dangerous. Jasper hefted the steam rivet gun, its pressure hose hissing malevolently. The tool was designed for emergency repairs on the asylum's iron infrastructure. Now it was being repurposed. They moved down the hall towards Ironside's cell. The giant was still methodically pulverizing the back wall, his back to the door. Unit 7, cease and desist. Graves barked, his voice a brittle imitation of command. Ironsides could not hear him. Jasper didn't hesitate. He leveled the rivet gun, braced himself, and pulled the trigger. The sound was a deafening PCOLM. A 6-inch steel rivet, designed to punch through half an inch of iron plate, shot across the cell and slammed into Ironside's lower back, right where his internal frame met his spine. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. Ironsides let out a roar that was less of pain and more of sheer systemic shock. He staggered, his legs giving way. He didn't fall like a man. He crashed like a felled tree, his body locking into a rigid, twisted pose. The rivet hadn't just injured him. It had jammed the very mechanism that allowed him movement. He lay on the floor, paralyzed, his eyes wide with a new, deeper terror. The terror of being truly, permanently trapped in a body that was now his ultimate prison. Finch stared, sickened. You scuttled him. Neutralized the threat. Graves corrected, his voice cold. Rufus, the projector in cell 8. Delens it. As they moved towards Lamplight's cell, a figure emerged from the swirling steam. Alara, from cell 12, her face pale but determined. Stop this. You're making it worse. Secure that one. Graves snapped to Finch without looking at her. But Finch didn't move. He looked from Alara's human fear to the warden's mechanical ruthlessness. He saw Rufus enter Lamplight's cell, pry bar raised, ready to shatter the delicate, nightmare-projecting lenses that were her eyes. He saw the path ahead, a corridor full of cells, each containing a unique horror to be neutralized with a rivet, a bar, or a hammer. This was not the way. This was the final, brutal perversion of Blackwood's dream. It wasn't order. It was slaughterhouse efficiency. You're wrong, Warden, Finch said, his voice low but clear. Graves turned, his eyes narrowing. What did you say? Matron Crab was wrong. Professor Abernathy was right. They're not machines. And this, he gestured at the rivet gun, at the paralyzed form of Ironsides. This isn't a solution. It's murder. He took a step back, away from the orderlies, towards Alara. The only way to fix this is to fix the source. We have to restart Margaret. Graves let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. You truly are an idiot. She is deceased. Her core spring has run down. It is a physical impossibility. Not according to Abernathy, Finch countered, a desperate plan forming. He said the master clock in the tower has a primary winding mechanism, a failsafe. We have to try. He was choosing a side, not with the brutal order of the wardens, and not with the chaotic despair of the patients. He was choosing the fragile, insane hope of a reboot. He looked at Alara, and she gave him a tiny, fierce nod. Warden Graves' face hardened into a mask of pure contempt. Then you are as corrupted as the rest of them. You are now designated a rogue element. Jasper Rufus. Apprehend him. The protocol applies to all malfunctioning units. The two orderlies turned from Lamplight's cell, their tools now aimed at Finch. The hunt was on. The world shrank to the space between one breath and the next. Jasper, hefting the steam rivet gun, and Rufus, brandishing the sharpened pry bar, advanced. Their faces, usually dull with bovine obedience, were now alight with the predatory glee. Finch was no longer a colleague. He was a malfunction to be corrected. Run, Alara screamed, grabbing Finch's arm and yanking him backwards. They fled down a side corridor, just as the PCOLM of the rivet gun echoed, the steel projectile embedding itself in the wall where Finch's head had been. The chase was a nightmare through a funhouse of horrors. The asylum itself had become a hostile entity. Steam vents erupted without warning, forcing them to leap over scalding geysers. Pneumatic doors slammed shut, trying to cut off their escape, only to shudder open a second later as the system's logic fought against itself. They found Professor Abernathy's cell door hanging open, the lock destroyed. The old man was still trapped in his immobilizing brace, but his eyes were wide with frantic urgency. "The clock tower," he wheezed as they skidded to a halt by his door. "You must reach the clock tower. It's the origin point. The master spring is there. It can send a reset pulse, but you must manually engage the coupling." "How?" Finch demanded, his eyes darting back down the corridor for signs of pursuit. "The central spire. The stairs are behind the warden's office. But the mechanism, it's been dormant for years. You'll need to." A roar from the Reverend Thorne cut him off. The man stood at the end of the hall, his mechanical arm raised high. "Heretics, you flee from the great ungearing. You must be purified in steam." He slammed his fist into a main pressure valve. With a shriek of tearing metal, the valve sheared off, and a thick, blinding cloud of high-pressure steam billowed towards them, filling the corridor like a tidal wave. "Go," Abernathy shouted. Finch and Alara ran, the scorching mist licking at their heels. They burst through the door to the administrative wing, slamming it shut against the boiling fog. The relative quiet was jarring, but the chaos was following. They could hear the rhythmic, crushing blows of Ironsides from the floor below, the ever-present dissonant choir, and now, the heavy, booted footsteps of their pursuers. The warden's office was unlocked. They barricaded the door behind them with a heavy cabinet, just as Jasper and Rufus began pounding on it from the other side. Finch's eye scanned the room, finding a small, arched oak door behind the warden's desk, almost hidden in the wood paneling. The entrance to the spire. The narrow, spiral staircase beyond was a world of its own. It was bitterly cold, the air thick with the smell of old grease and dust. The stone steps were worn smooth by time, coiling up into a profound darkness. The only light came from the eerie, pulsating glow of the fungal pods that lined the walls, casting their sickly light on the intricate cobwebs that draped the ancient clockwork mechanisms embedded in the central column. They climbed for what felt like an eternity, the sounds of the asylum fading below, replaced by the groaning of the tower and the wind and a deep, profound ticking that grew louder with every step. It was the sound of immense, dormant power. Finally, they emerged into the heart of the machine. The clock tower chamber was a cathedral to Blackwood's ambition. It was a vast, cylindrical space, dominated by a colossal, complex arrangement of interlocking gears, some taller than a man. A massive, polished brass pendulum, now still, hung in the center. And there, against the far wall, was the master spring. It was a drum of burnished steel, wider than a carriage wheel, with a keyhole the size of Finch's forearm at its center. It was the physical heart of Blackwater, the primary power source that Margaret had regulated. But between them and the mechanism stood a final, terrible sight. Lamplight stood before the master spring, her back to them. Her lens-like eyes were projecting onto the great gears themselves. But the image was no longer a chaotic nightmare. It was a single, repeating loop. Margaret's face, her human eye full of a profound, weary sadness, and her brass eye, cold and dead. "She's drawn to the power source," Alara whispered, her voice full of pity. "She's trying to find the signal. She's trying to find her." As they watched, Lamplight reached out a trembling hand towards the cold, dead spring. She was a lost child, seeking the comfort of a mother who was gone. The pounding from the staircase grew louder. The orderlies were breaking through. They had seconds. Finch looked at the massive keyhole, then at the grief-stricken Lamplight, and then at Alara. The path to salvation was blocked by a ghost, and the hunters were at the gate. There was no more time for plans, only for a desperate, final act of faith. Time fractured. The pounding on the staircase door was a final, frantic heartbeat. Lamplight, lost in her projected grief, was a fragile, living obstacle between them and salvation. Finch's mind, stripped of all nuance, saw only a sequence of actions, a final, desperate program to run. "The key," he shouted to Alara, his voice raw as he pointed to the massive, ornate winding key hanging on a hook beside the dormant spring drum. It was a giant, brutal version of the one he had used on Margaret. Alara didn't hesitate. She darted forward, her movements silent and fluid, as the door at the top of the stairs splintered. Jasper's face, contorted with effort, appeared in the breach. Finch didn't go for the key. He moved towards Lamplight. "Lillian," he said, using her real name for the first time. She flinched, the projection of Margaret's face flickering. "She's not there, but we can help her. We can help all of them." He reached for her, not to restrain, but to guide. At that moment, the door exploded inwards. Rufus charged through, the sharpened pry bar held like a spear. His target was Finch, but his path took him straight towards Lamplight. The world slowed. Finch saw the glint of the sharpened steel, the vacant terror in Lamplight's eyes. He threw himself forward, shoving her out of the way. The pry bar meant for his ribs grazed his arm, tearing through cloth and flesh with a searing pain. They fell in a tangle of limbs, the projection of Margaret's face dissolving into a shower of static light on the gears above. "The key, Alara!" Finch roared, wrestling with the heavier, stronger orderly. Alara strained, lifting the heavy, iron key. It was impossibly weighty. She staggered towards the spring drum, the key held like a knight's lance. Jasper entered, leveling the rivet gun. He didn't aim at Finch. He aimed at Alara. "Drop it, you little glitch." A new sound cut through the chamber, a low, resonant, grinding click. Then another. It wasn't the sound of the clockwork. It was the sound of a massive, internal mechanism re-engaging after a long silence. All eyes turned to the master spring. The great drum trembled. A shudder ran through the entire tower. The colossal gears, frozen for years, gave a groaning lurch. A single, deep, resonant boom echoed through the chamber, the sound of a primordial heart kicking once, twice, and then settling into a slow, powerful, earth-shaking rhythm. Tum, tum, tum. Alara hadn't touched it. The key was still in her hands. The reset pulse had not come from the tower. It had come from below, down in the special wing. In the profound silence of Cell 1, a spark jumped a frozen gap. A gear, forced into motion by a final, stored ounce of potential energy, turned one tooth, then another. The intricate mainspring in Margaret Greaves's chest, subjected to this sudden, violent jolt, tightened with a shriek of protesting metal. Her brass eye lens glowed to life, not with its former soft light, but with a piercing, furious white. Her head jerked up. The human side of her face was still slack in death, but the mechanical side was alive with vengeful purpose. Her voice, when it came, was no longer a discordant blend of human and machine. It was pure, amplified mechanism, a deafening broadcast that blasted from her cell and echoed through every pipe and wire in Blackwater. "My children." The effect was instantaneous. In the tower, the warring frequencies of the whispering choir snapped into a single, unified, and terrifyingly aggressive tone. The random slamming of doors ceased, every pneumatic lock disengaging at once with a simultaneous, deafening thunk. The hissing steam vents fell silent. The asylum held its breath. In the clock tower, Jasper and Rufus froze, their tools lowering, faces blank with a terror beyond comprehension. Margaret's voice echoed again, a wave of pure command. "The cage is open." From every cell, from every dark corner, the hybrid patients emerged. They did not shamble or rage. They moved with a new, chilling synchronicity. Ironsides, the rivet still jammed in his back, walked with a stiff, determined gait, his eyes fixed on a single purpose. The whispering choir stepped into the corridor, their mouths open in a silent, focused hum. The Reverend Thorne fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in submission. Margaret Greaves, the clockwork crone, took her first step out of Cell 1. Her movements were no longer frail. They were the deliberate, powerful motions of a queen ascending her throne. She was no longer a regulator. She was a sovereign, and her kingdom was waiting. The final, Crushing THOM from the master, Spring shook the tower. Finch, clutching his bleeding arm, looked at Alara. The key was useless now. The system hadn't been rebooted. It had been reborn, and it was hungry. Thank you for watching. First of all, the stories we tell are either entirely fictional or inspired by real events. If you have any stories you'd like to share with us, let's chat in the comment section. If you liked our story, we'd appreciate it if you gave our video a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on our next videos. You can check out the playlist created for other stories on our channel in the card section at the top right. See you in the next video.